Want to learn more about directed paraphrasing? Stay tuned. Informal assessment strategies are useful techniques that focus on a small amount of course content and are used at the beginning or end of a lesson. Instructors can use these to keep a record of learning. One technique is directed paraphrasing. Let's take a closer look. In directed paraphrasing, students use their own words to paraphrase a particular part of a lesson for a specific audience and purpose. It essentially provides students the opportunity to summarize and restate information that they learned and understood to be important. This technique assesses how well students understand what they have learned and how well they will use their own words to explain important information and concepts to others, including those outside of the classroom. This type of paraphrasing is unique in that it is directed at a particular audience for a specific reason, allowing it to be useful and a valuable technique for both students and instructors. Keep watching for a step-by-step guide to effectively use directed paraphrasing in your classroom. Start off by picking an important part of the lesson, for example, a theory, concept, or argument the students have studied. The topic should be one that has some reference to outside of the classroom. Next, decide on a realistic but challenging audience that students could paraphrase this topic for. If students know the topic very well, pick 2 different audiences. Then determine some guidelines for the paraphrase, including the purpose, as well as the number of written words, sentences, or length of time to speak. It's now time for you to respond to the directed paraphrase yourself and decide how realistic the task is. Are you able to successfully write a directed paraphrase for the decided audience and using the specific guidelines? You are now ready to give your students information about the directed paraphrase. Make sure you provide the topic, the purpose, the audience or audiences, the guidelines on number of words, sentences, or time to speak, and finally, the amount of time students have to respond. This next step is where you collect the directed paraphrases. These can be videotaped, audio recorded, written, or verbally expressed in the classroom. If you are not video or audio recording, note that students should write out their directed paraphrases, even though in reality these are usually verbal. Finally, it's time to review the directed paraphrases, and there are 2 common ways. You could collect written directed paraphrases and organize these by separating them into 4 piles according to the following categories: confused, minimal, adequate, and excellent. With these, assess each directed paraphrase response by comparing both within and across the categories. A useful tip is to pay attention to 3 characteristics, including accuracy, suitability for the intended audience or audiences, and how effective the directed response accomplished the purpose. Another way to review the directed paraphrases is to pick out the clearest and muddiest points, circling them with different colored pens, and then looking for patterns that might indicate clarity or confusion. Now that you've learned more about directed paraphrasing, you may be wondering where to use it. This technique could work in a variety of contexts because the ability to translate information into language that others, for example, customers, clients, or coworkers can understand is a very useful and valuable skill. Some examples of classroom contexts that this strategy would work best in include a second language acquisition classroom, public health fields, law and criminal justice, education, and marketing. All of these contexts have realistic audiences that can be provided to whom students can express their directed paraphrase. Here are some examples of directed paraphrase in 2 different types of classrooms. The first is an English as a second language classroom, and the second is a nursing studies classroom. Feel free to pause the video, read over these examples, make some notes, and then use them in your own classroom. Let's take a look at some limitations for directed paraphrasing. Unless strict guidelines are outlined, this technique can take a lengthy amount of time and effort to provide an adequate assessment. In addition, it can be difficult to create qualitative criteria for an effective paraphrase and to make this criteria clear to students. Finally, some students' paraphrasing techniques may not improve as well as others unless the instructor provides specific individualized feedback, and this can be time-consuming. Let's take a look at the advantages that directed paraphrasing has for both students and instructors. For students in particular, directed paraphrasing helps develop the ability to make course content meaningful, since students express what they learned in their own words. It also strengthens students' ability to both comprehend and communicate the information learned. Furthermore, directed paraphrasing allows the instructor to see how well students have understood and internalized the information. It can also provide direction for instruction, as well as for revising the syllabus if and when needed, based on how well students express understanding of the material. In addition, directed paraphrasing also allows both students and the instructor to see how information learned in class has an application and relevance to outside the classroom. And finally, it also allows students and instructors to consider the needs and interests of the chosen audience. Now that you're ready to use this technique, keep in mind some best practices. Remember to choose an authentic audience, as this allows students to practice for real-life situations. Also, by focusing on a very specific and sometimes most difficult part of the lesson, you're allowing students to express whether or not they really understood this part of the lessons, since they are able to explain it in their own words. You can also test students by providing more than one type of audience for students to paraphrase the same piece of information to, and then ask them to explain the differences between the two paraphrases. Furthermore, to provide dialogue in the class, assign different students to different topics and then ask them to share with each other in the classroom. This will also allow you to cover different parts of the lesson. Finally, provide students handouts that have examples of well-written paraphrases. Feedback is essential to learning, and with directed paraphrasing, feedback can be provided in a variety of ways. You could give each student a written checklist that has the strong and weak points of his or her directed paraphrase. You could provide verbal feedback individually. You could also review both good and poor examples of the directed paraphrase with the entire class, or even get someone who is from your chosen audience to provide the feedback. Finally, you could allow students to role-play the audience role while others provide their directed paraphrase and then provide feedback to everyone. Now that you've learned about directed paraphrasing, here are some important things to keep in mind. Remember, to ensure meaningful assessment and learning, the directed paraphrase needs to be well planned and structured. Choosing the audience and determining the purpose is very important. Also, remember that some of the students' first attempts may not look like the students' own words, since most do not have practiced paraphrasing in their own words. And finally, this technique should be used more than once during the course in order to ensure both students and instructors learn from the process. Thanks for watching. Feel free to pause the video and take a closer look at any of the references for further information and tips.